Well, just I'll give a very brief introduction on Marx School. Marx School is a discussion forum. We started a couple of years ago. Its main objective is to critically examine, deploy in Marxian dialectics, the processes, structures, and events as they have unfolded. We have both local and international speakers so far, like Michael Roberts from UK, a Marxian political economist, and Ed Tatum from Philippines, Pritam Singh from UK and Punjab, Achin Manaik from India, Delhi. In addition to the local speakers, they also participated in the Marx School. And in coming events, we have Dr. Jairus Banerjee, and he will talk on the mercantile capitalism and things like that.
Laying the field. I'm just laying the field and putting out certain crucial, facts, certain dimensions and observations, hopefully so that, activists here can further discuss them, think about them, and fine-tune their strategy for the coming months. There's a lot of echo. Should I stop till that muting happens? Am I okay? The echo is stopped. Great.
You can continue, yeah.
Okay, great. So first things first, I'd like to start with saying that I've been receiving a lot of messages via Facebook Messenger from comrades, from others, in the left, Sri Lankan left, and I just wanted to, and other people, and I just wanted to start with perhaps addressing some of those, because I think the audience would also get to know me better and where I'm coming from. I was not very active on Facebook, comrades, and basically the Sri Lankan movement encouraged me to connect with many Sri Lankan activists. And so it's been, quite an interesting, contact and interface. And in these, conversations, someone, using FB Messenger asked me just a few days ago that how come most of your Facebook friends are the Sri Lankan left? And I laughed, when I saw that message, I laughed out loud. And then I replied saying that, what can I do if they, they are the most active, conscious people in the Sri Lankan movement right now. And perhaps all the right-wingers have joined the government. So obviously, this is going to be my friend list. I also remember seeing a screenshot from a tweet by Ranil Wickremesinghe in May, I think 9th May, where he's, opposing the government, the then government's repressive measures against, protesters and activists. And ironically, now he is heading the repressive state apparatus. So, of course, I'll be sharing some observations, as I have been earlier also, about this, so-called new government and the so-called elected president. Another person asked me on Facebook, that you have not written on Sri Lanka earlier. So, somewhere questioning where I'm coming from. Again, I laughed, out loud, and I just like to say that, I ended up replying like this also, what can I do if the Sri Lankan People's Movement did not wait for my theoretical intervention? So indeed, before I could write about Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka's people had already started their movement and had shown so many of us, an interesting, possibility is unfolding. So my theory, yes, has to catch up with that of the movement in Sri Lanka. And I therefore present my reflections in that light for all of us to go back and think about and deliberate on further. I just like to say one more, opening, a small, observation is that, when I was looking at the movement as it was unfolding, images, write-ups, it was very interesting to see how, many of you, comrades had, strategically and tactfully built a certain kind of platform with certain kind of acceptable faces and leaders in the protest camps being there, such as priests and other religious heads. And I found that fantastic, because I felt that I was aware before this moment that in Sri Lanka there is, of course, this there is a majoritarianism, and there is a strong Sinhalese, chauvinism. But it was interesting to see how, these were so quickly overcome, and a movement built around different religious leaders, including a Christian priest. And of course, there's a whole conspiracy theory in the right-wing media that I am just because I inherited my father's name, who's a Christian. That I'm from the Christian lobby, etc. But having said this, I'm not a believer. I just like to clarify again where I'm coming from. I'm a communist, do not believe in any kind of chauvinism. And interestingly, I grew up in a family where my own father, was a very, not at all convinced with the way in which the Christian faith existed. And he often told us a story when we used to ask why he didn't go to church. That there was this man sitting outside a church once, and an elderly man came up to him as well and said, "Why are you sitting here and looking so sad?" And this young man was not very well dressed, said, "Well, the church didn't allow me inside." And the old man smiled and said, "Well, don't worry, that happened to me as well." And the young man looked at the old gentleman, and he was quite well dressed, the old gentleman, not badly dressed. "Why did they throw you out? You are still well dressed and look from a decent, well-to-do background." He said, "No, they did it to me too." And he said, "Okay, then who are you? Why did they throw you out?" So the old man said, "Well, son, I'm God." So in the sense that many of the institutions like the church, and we know what religion today has become. So just to clarify that, in terms of whatever linkages and conspiracy theories are going on, I am ultimately somebody who does not stand for any kind of chauvinism. I am a communist, and therefore I extend complete solidarity with your movement, with precisely those, ideals and aspirations. Having said these things, I'd like to just, share what our observations here have been after closely watching your movement here from India. Now, of course, the People's Movement, Iraqlia, has entered into a deadlock. And this has been evident with, the so-called selection, I don't call it the election, but the selection of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the president a few days back on the 19th of July. Now, of course, within hours, and we were expecting this. I mean, we were fools not to expect this. Within hours of him assuming office, a midnight crackdown on the key protest camp unfolded. That's the Gallifey's Green protest camp. And of course, it's only cowards, as I said this earlier, only cowards attack in the dead of night because they have so much to hide during the day. Now, once the Gallifey's Green protest camp was dismantled, was removed in this violent way, we know sporadic arrests and intimidation of activists and leaders have become the norm. Despite brutal state repression, however, it's fantastic to see that the People's Movement, Viraglia, is showing a resilience, a certain commitment to continue. And this resilience stems from the simple fact that, people are fighting Ranil Wickremesinghe for the same reason why they were fighting his predecessors, the Rajapaksas. Now, I think this is a very interesting situation that we have seen, because this is the first time in the country's history that a serving president, has fled the country, especially at such terrible times. And a parliament which has otherwise lost its legitimacy over the last few months voted in a new president. This has been an election that has been seen by many people, especially I believe in the left, as a political gimmick that has been desperately played out by cunning politicians, power-hungry politicians, and this is precisely the kind of nexus within the parliament which led to Wickremesinghe getting those 134 votes. And he, of course, owes those votes to the support that he has garnered from the ruling coalition, and particularly the Rajapaksa's party, the SLPP, which has the majority of seats in the Sri Lankan parliament. Let's remember that Wickremesinghe himself is only one person from the UNP in the Sri Lankan parliament, so he's that way outnumbered, and so is beholden and dependent on the Rajapaksa's party, the SLPP. Of course, this election, so-called election of Ranil Wickremesinghe, is a travesty. And the decision of the Sri Lankan parliamentarians to allow Wickremesinghe, who is a puppet, in the hands of the International Monetary Fund, and we're going to talk more about the IMF. We're going to talk more about imperialism in this particular conjuncture. And of course, we're going to talk more about insiders, the enemies inside Sri Lanka in terms of Sri Lankan capitalists and wealthy. But of course, what I want to say quickly in the beginning itself is that, this so-called new president, who is completely delegitimized, is someone who is, the blue-eyed boy of imperialist forces like the IMF, World Bank, and he's going to be around till 2024 until we don't change strategy and build anew and give new momentum to the movement. Of course, by bringing him into the post of president, the 225 parliamentarians themselves have exposed their illegitimacy. And therefore, this election that happened on the 19th is an illegitimate maneuver, because on the one hand, it gives a new lease of life to the much despised and much discredited executive presidency system that has been in Sri Lanka since the 70s. And on the other hand, this election and the involvement of the parliamentarians in this has allowed ultimately a crony, a blue-eyed boy of the imperialist and capitalist forces to dictate the terms of Sri Lanka's so-called economic recovery. So, Wickremesinghe's meteoric rise within, the government, from prime minister in May to, becoming the president of Sri Lanka, this meteoric rise within, the government in terms of powerful positions is, of course, as I just said, despite the fact that his own party, the UNP, was badly defeated in the last parliamentary election. And basically, the party gained only one seat in the parliament, which went to Wickremesinghe due to the national cumulative vote of the UNP. Now, given this, dynamics that there's, that Wickremesinghe only is one person from the UNP in the entire parliament, we can expect him, and that's precisely what he's doing. And I'll show some facts to emphasize this when I move on. He's expectedly going to work in close coordination, and is working in close coordination with the interests of the ruling elites. Not surprisingly, then, all the cabinet members of the former government, the government that was in existence before this sham election happened, all the cabinet members of the former government have been retained in the new government formed by Wickremesinghe. Now, the result, of this 19 July, election, so-called election, for the post of president, left many people feeling, of course, low, and it seems, it has been as if we've returned to the same point from where we started the movement. Of course, there are some, voices that we have heard, that, let the parliament, let the parliament proceed, the parliament will bring about or work with some kind of justice. It will listen to the people's voices from the grounds. And so while many were making, appeals to the conscience of these 225 MPs, literally these politicians, these parliamentarians were hatching a conspiracy against the people. And so I keep saying this, it is imperative to note that while a larger body of people in the movement were very, very, suspicious and apprehensive of these 225 parliamentarians, because there were some quarters that, felt that these institutions like the parliament could still deliver justice. We lost crucial time. But we cannot forget that, we have learned from this moment, and that there was a wider sense of distrust that existed, which was even reflected in the slogans. It was not just a demand, or very quickly the initial demand, to remove the Rajapaksas from the post of president, translated into the resignation, the demand for resignation of all 225 MPs. Now, of course, despite the apprehension, the large apprehension in the movement about these 225 parliamentarians and what they would do, considering they were otherwise people who were part of, power-hungry, self-seeking politicians, were part of an obsolete representative system, which had overseen, for a long time, overseen the crash of the Sri Lankan economy, particularly since 2020, when things have been bad due to the pandemic and later with the outbreak of the war with Ukraine. Despite the apprehensions, wider apprehensions, continuously we were hearing these kind of voices that, due process should be given a chance, due process, should be allowed, so that the parliament, will elect a new president, or let's have snap elections and have, through election process, have a new government. Now, these are all, assessments which are, deeply problematic. Let's just take this, first one, that, now that the government has been formed by Wickremesinghe, give it some time, let's see what happens. But the point is that, the reality is, what does Wickremesinghe represent? We have to be very clear about what, powers and what interests and calculations, his office, his presidency actually is going to perpetuate. Similarly, the parliament, is an institution, even now for the majority of people, the parliament does not represent the interests and aspirations of the masses, and it has lost its legitimacy completely by, so-called electing Ranil Wickremesinghe as president, and now by passing those, ratifying those provisions of emergency, just a few days back. So it has, the parliament has lost its, legitimacy. So we're looking at an entire political structure itself. The edifice itself is proven so anti-people, both the presidency and the parliament, that, we need to be very, very, very cautious and very aggressive on this question of, what do you mean by due process? Due process is returning us back again and again to where we are starting from, where the problem starts from. Now, Wickremesinghe's, election again was something that was, it was a foregone conclusion even before the 19th of July. Many of us were saying this, that he's going to come into the, power, he's going to be elected, right? Because of the nature of the nefarious behind the scenes negotiations that were happening between these parliamentarians, and the fact that the SLPP, the Rajapaksa party, is the majority party in the parliament. They were going to go with Wickremesinghe. So we knew that, and we lost crucial time when this election was announced on the 14th of July. It was announced on the 14th of July. We didn't have a concerted action program in place. And it has basically resulted in a foregone conclusion materializing, that is Wickremesinghe becoming president. Now, of course, the Janata Ragleya, the people's movement, continues to valiantly fight, the thugs of the ruling elites. And it has, bravely risen to counter every attack that's been made on it. Now, given this fact that, that we are continuously now firefighting like this, the gains of the movement, the gains of the Janata Ragleya and people's power, is at a verge where it may be overwhelmed. It may be arrested by this new government, by the sheer use of force, by these, emergency provisions that have been, brought in and now recently even ratified by the parliament. So this really brings us to the questions, or, the burning questions of the day, which are, that, and the answers lie in the fact that, how are we envisaging people's power and the institutionalization of people's power in the coming days? We therefore need to think very, very seriously and concretely at this juncture in history, when we're literally in a position, we're literally poised to bring about a revolutionary transformation if we regroup, if we re-strategize. So yes, at this present moment, one crucial observation one has is that, the Araglia, the movement is in a complicated situation of deadlock that has, because of the repression that is happening, because also numbers, have dwindled, gone back to the village, the towns, it has translated into a loss of momentum, that we, actually set a pace by not responding fast on the call for elections to the president's post on 14 July. Now, this loss of momentum is therefore due to certain strategic mistakes made by the leadership. And, because of certain limitations of the movement, though, of course, this movement has to be seen as a culmination and a continuation of other prior moments of struggle in Sri Lanka. And I'm referring here to the struggle of small indebted farmers. I'm talking about the huge general strikes by workers earlier this year in 2022. I'm talking about the struggles of teachers and many other segments of the urban workforce. So really, the Araglia as it stands, in the month of June, July, was a culmination of these prior moments of intensive struggle. And what we saw, therefore, till a few days back, was that, for the first time, building up on these movements and their massive discontent and their mobilizations, for the first time, the general movement came to a point of very categorically and very strategically addressing the question of state power. Now, the movement found itself strategically lacking in certain quarters. We saw, opportunistically, certain political parties, came into the movement, and many of these, parties, are ideologically, bankrupt. So we are talking about an ideological bankruptcy of many parties which have allied themselves with the wider movement. They were throwing in their, lot, hitching their bandwagon to the, emerging Araglia. And simply, many such, politicians, many such political, parties simply wanted to, politically use the Araglia, the people's struggle, and that too very much with the given, political framework. So many breakaway parties, basically they were discontent with the mainstream parent party, and then they, became supporters of the Araglia. But they were not thinking in terms of re-envisaging the political system, the so-called representative system of politics in Sri Lanka. They were very happy to work within that. They just wanted a few people, a few politicians in the helm of affairs to be removed from certain posts that they and the government. So it was just a little bit of cosmetic change, and these so-called opportunistic politicians and political parties would continue functioning within the given status quo and structure of representative politics. Specifically, what can we say about the parties of the left? Here too, an observation that I'd like to share. And this is also speaking from experience, comrades, speaking from the kind of dilution we have seen of the broader left movement in India. And at various crucial moments when big struggles have emerged, how even the Indian left has struggled with gaining its foothold and an entrenched influence on these movements. So parties of the left, even in the case of Sri Lanka today, were too constrained by the politics of the parliamentary representative system. And here, of course, the role and the actions strategy of the JVP is a big concern for many of us. As I said just a few minutes back, when the so-called elections for the post of president was announced on the 14th of July, rather than attacking that modus operandi, exposing the hollowness of that election and demanding that the alternative be created and not just another president brought in to the same corrupt institutions. We find that interestingly, the JVP floated its own presidential candidate who got just 3 votes. So it was not even a good strategy for, the JVP's own attempt, for revival. And in a wider audience, it was seen by many, as part of, the same joining hands, the JVP joining hands, the same kind of politics that the ruling, majority party and other, mainstream parties stood for. Now, half-heartedly, other political forces, this would be my third observation, half-heartedly other political forces in Sri Lanka, was seen raising a very crucial issue related to, of course, the institutionalization of people's power. So, not very concretely, not very forcefully was the issue of the formation of a People's Council, deliberated on, mobilized, people are not mobilized on it. And we, as I keep saying, we literally, see that many within the left just waited as if, the parliament would, usher in some kind of, justice and a needed restructuring. Why would the parliament do that? Why would it dig its own grave and constitute a People's Council? It wouldn't do that. So the movement lost momentum, eventually, and has reached this kind of a stage of a deadlock. And we lost, a strategic advantage that we had earlier in July. The president fled. What I'm basically trying to get at is the president fled. Gotabaya Rajapaksa left, and he left behind him a power vacuum. And in that situation of a power vacuum, it was no open, and it was an open secret. It was that there was no doubting this, that that power vacuum would be very quickly filled by the parliament, by choosing someone like Ranil Wickremesinghe. It was really a foregone conclusion. And at that juncture, therefore, those of us who were really serious about pushing through the alternative, pushing through the institutionalization of the people's power through bodies like the People's Council, we should have actually at that juncture, when the election was announced on 14 July, we should not have wasted crucial time. And we should have actually announced, that on 19 July, when the parliamentarians were going to have an election, so-called election for the post of president, that would have been the day, 19 July, that we would have a people's march to the parliament. The movement, therefore, what I'm trying to indicate is that the Janta Raglia has allowed the ruling establishment to regroup itself over the last few days. And therefore, from an offensive that we'd started with as a movement, we are increasingly being forced to retreat in a defensive position. Now we're defending activists who are facing intimidation and etc. However, saying this, however, sharing these immediate observations, of course, let me say that for us closely watching what's happening and extending solidarity, even we know that all is not lost. We know that the political establishment is not popular with the people, not popular with the Sri Lankan people. And there's still echoes, the call for the resignation of all 225 parliamentarians. And when they ended up ratifying the emergency provisions a few days back, it was so evident, to the ordinary Sri Lankan people that, worse times are coming, and these people are basically, the parliamentarians are basically facilitating it. So I say at this point, we can still regroup, the movement can still regroup, we can still give an ultimatum to the parliament to pass a resolution prohibiting the use of the police, the military against civilian protesters. We know they're going to fumble on this, and that is going to be a major litmus test for the parliament, and it can be a breaking point at which we clinch through the mass mobilization of people for this march to the parliament. We can clinch a way forward. We can clinch a way for the alternative to be built, to be enforced. And therefore, I say that the date of the ultimatum for the parliament to pass the resolution against the use of the military and police on civilian protesters that date of ultimatum we give the parliament should strategically be the day that we choose for the people's march to the parliament. So just having shared these, immediate, reflections and observations on, what we're seeing at this present juncture in terms of, the struggle, the various political forces, and those that are participating within the Janta Raglia. Let me just quickly move on and, build on the reflections that, one has about, of course, the economic conditions and the economic, way forward, the recovery possible for the Sri Lankan economy and her people. So this will bring me into a more detailed, reflection on, the imperialist forces like the IMF and also local capital, the dominance of local capital. And therefore, how we need to factor that in, those dynamics of imperialism and local capital into our future strategy and our regrouping. Let's just highlight a few important facts, which of course I feel that these are facts that we are familiar with. We know that the situation is very bad in terms of everyday life of the people. There's a huge crisis in terms of accessing fuel, essential commodities, particularly ration, medicines, and it's a frightening situation. But having said this, for all of us here who are Marxists, we know that an economic crisis is never felt, is never experienced in the same way. There is a differential impact of an economic crisis like this. So definitely all Sri Lankan people are not facing the same economic troubles. So the rich, the dominant economic classes, the bureaucracy, the ruling elites, they're not the ones who are going hungry. They're not the ones who are having to stand in endless queues for these meager rations and quotas of fuel. And we just have to look at the way in which, Sri Lanka society is deeply hierarchical along class lines. I mean, we have a small, minuscule 10%, which is extremely wealthy and rich, even has, offshore accounts, even has, properties and investments abroad. And, this rich 10% strata owns 63.8% of the country's total wealth. And the vast, 50% of Sri Lankan society owns a minuscule 4.3% of the country's total wealth. So there's, of course, a marked disparity that has existed in Sri Lanka, and therefore this economic crisis been differentially experienced. So while the poor have toiled away to sustain the economy, and during this economic crisis, they've lost jobs, gone hungry, the rich continue to amass wealth. And when I talk about, the underhand dealings of the IMF, including the insiders, Sri Lankan capitalists and wealthy who are involved in this so-called debt crisis, I think it's to be very clear, that how the rich are actually benefiting even as we speak today, in terms of a so-called bailout package being negotiated with the IMF. So really, the rich continue to amass wealth. They have been, and they continue to even today. And the poor continue to accumulate miseries. So it's really the wealthy who, alone project this new Wickremesinghe government as being capable of bringing about much talked about stability and peace. And the mainstream media, of course, is echoing these kind of views. But we know the reality. The reality is that, the new President Wickremesinghe is already, and in fact, in coming days, going to intensify the introduction of measures which, are going to basically be ushering in more and more austerity measures. So really, in the name of fiscal prudence, so-called responsible governance, we're only going to see the economic crisis worsen, the burden being borne by the laboring masses and poor peasantry. Now, of course, the regime, the Wickremesinghe regime, the wealthy, the economically dominant classes, and of course, pseudo-economists and so-called financial troubleshooters are going all out, peddling various myths about, the recovery that, this new government is going to usher in. But as I saying that, this is not going to be any kind of fiscal prudence that's going to bring Sri Lanka out of the misery. And it's definitely not going to be a bailout package, which is going to help Sri Lanka purchase essential commodities from the world market. It's actually basically just going to be the ushering in of several IMF, International Monetary Fund dictated austerity measures. And the money, most of it is going to be used not to buy essential commodities, but to basically pay back creditors. So this is a dangerous situation that is actually going to unfold very quickly in the coming days. So let us be very clear that whatever is being negotiated with the IMF is most of the time in secrecy. We very often sitting in Sri Lanka, or those of us, who are trying to understand the situation, we don't even know how much the debt is. The debt figures themselves are contestable. We also know that there are some big legal firms sitting abroad who are representing Sri Lanka in the IMF negotiations, and they deliberately misrepresent the value of Sri Lankan assets, bonds, etc. And so in these underhand top secret negotiations, we don't even know what and how much Sri Lanka is actually losing in terms of her resources and her assets in the process of the bailout package being negotiated. So, I'll further elaborate on this by talking to you more about sovereign bonds and how this whole, debt trap has surfaced. But let me for now just say that the entire framework within which the IMF package, so-called bailout package, is being trashed out. It is definitely based on this principle that the wealth of the rich is not going to be touched. In fact, you will see in my following discussion points that the rich are going to benefit. And so really the IMF dictated austerity measures are going to impact the laboring masses, the common people. There's going to be no wealth redistribution happening at all. And therefore, I would like to move on and say that the purpose of this Wickremesinghe government, is basically therefore providing, a facade of change, and it's granting basically much needed breathing space to these corrupt, beleaguered politicians, while very strategically preparing the ground for anti-democratic measures that are needed to impose the International Monetary Fund's diktats. Now, to better comprehend, the impact of, the International Monetary Fund or the IMF's so-called bailout package, and the appended or attached austerity measures, it is imperative to, as I keep saying, working with this very, very clear picture that, there is a differential impact of the economic crisis. The economic collapse did not affect everyone in the same way. There were ubiquitous power cuts. People struggled to get food, struggled to get fuel, medicines. But very soon the rich people's situation in Sri Lanka stabilized, and ultimately it's their servants who have stood in lines of food and fuel. So there's been a scarcity not for the wealthy, but a scarcity for the poor. And it's the poor who have struggled and will continue to struggle to buy essentials, while the rich, of course, continue to hoard in bulk, given their higher purchasing power. Of course, this means the rich are not the ones who are going to sacrifice, but the poor who will have to sacrifice the most, something I keep saying, and something we need to take to the people. We need to take to the people as we regroup and bring back the momentum into the movement. Even at the height of the present economic crisis, all we need to do is very clearly show this and explain this, that the rich in Sri Lanka are not beleaguered by the problem of food scarcity, because food is not a huge part or portion of their expenses anyway. In contrast, food expenses eat up almost the whole of the meager income of the poor in Sri Lanka. So we have to remember this. The differential impact of the economic crisis, even as we speak today. So that's going to persist and continue, and things are going to get worse for the poor as the so-called IMF bailout package materializes and is introduced. So definitely what, many of us, here have been argued is that, at a time when most Sri Lankans are struggling to eat 2 square meals a day, and daily wages, for a very significant section of the working population in Sri Lanka, are the hardest hit. Politicians and corporates are known to have stashed away their $1 million in offshore bank accounts. Again, when taking some examples about how the debt trap has been created for Sri Lanka, I will show to you how several politicians of Sri Lanka, several wealthy people in Sri Lanka are actually very much involved in this debt trap. And they have earned huge amounts of money, which are, of course, locked away in offshore bank accounts. So it is important to understand that the economy is created through an extensive exploitation of labor. And remember, therefore, Araglia's very important, initial momentum is, the struggles of workers in Sri Lanka. The movement saw a comeback. The trade union movement saw a comeback through these general strikes in April and May. So it is the labor of the working masses which creates the wealth of Sri Lanka. But of course, this wealth is ruthlessly appropriated by the rich. The stolen wealth, for many of us who call ourselves, Marxist, communists, the stolen wealth belongs to the country because it is society's vast majority, the laboring people, who have created it in the first place. So really, this moment is about anchoring our politics, our strategy, our regrouping on this crucial question of, the alternative now is only the reappropriation of wealth created by the laboring poor. That is the only possible path to Sri Lanka's economic recovery. And of course, the alternative also now can only be the institutionalization of people's power through people's assemblies, through people's councils. So this is what we need to take back to the people for further mobilization. Now, I would just like to say that, the prominent section of the rich, in Sri Lanka, and of course, these are also your non-resident Sri Lankans who are based abroad, the diaspora, the wealthy diaspora. A prominent section of them earns their income in dollars, which simply, means that its income, this rich strata's income, is actually increasing with the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy. Many millionaires and billionaires were simply looting Sri Lanka and hoarding their ill-gotten wealth in dollars. This has been achieved through various measures, which I now want to elaborate. For example, export companies often avoided, paying higher duty, custom duty through practices like misinvoicing, not showing the correct billing or invoicing. Similarly, transfer pricing, was another method that was used by export companies. And all these malpractices, we need to remember that these are very entrenched malpractices. And in this context, one can understand that the brokering of a bailout package with the IMF is simply going to help, the Sri Lankan, local capitalist, Sri Lanka's wealthy segment that is already benefiting from these situations. And it's precisely why, the wealthy in Sri Lanka therefore want Wickremesinghe to remain in the helm of affairs. And of course, if he does continue as president and the situation continues like this, it basically represents, a tragedy where, Sri Lanka basically jumped out of a frying pan, one bad situation, into the fire, a worse one. So ultimately, in the name of overcoming the IMF, the economic crisis, an IMF bailout, so-called bailout package, would end up reproducing and intensifying the crisis in its worst possible form, the burden of which the poor, the common people, the laboring masses are going to bear. Now, of course, we're at a crossroad. I've used this analogy earlier. We're at a crossroad. I mean, things can go either way. Not all is lost, but we are in a complicated situation. We're at a crossroad where one road is where the ruling clique, the ruling elites, the capitalists, that's the economic dominant class, and imperialist forces want and are pushing Sri Lanka to go down that path, which is basically a path that benefits very few people. To understand this path, which is backed by the ruling clique, the capitalists and imperialist forces, and of course, to understand better its repercussions in the coming days, let us look at, very closely the country's debt crisis. What is the, important observations that are coming out with respect to this debt crisis, especially the observation that it is actually a manufactured or staged crisis. Now, first, of course, let us be very, very clear, and I'm sure most of us here know this, that the country, has a history, a long history of struggling. Sri Lanka has a long history of struggling with Western debt burdens. It has gone through 16 so-called economic stabilizing programs with, the International Monetary Fund, which is, a heavily US American dominated, funding agency. Now, therefore, we find that, for a long time now, almost, 30, almost 30 to 40 years, some even say 50 years almost, we have seen the micromanagement of Sri Lanka's, economy being dictated by these various IMF, International Monetary Fund programs. Of course, in 2021, therefore, we see these really alarming, staggering, figures where, 81%, literally 81% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt was owned by American and European financial institutions, including allies of the Western world. This means Japan and India. China has always been a much smaller component in terms of the foreign debt that Sri Lanka owes China. Now, in 2019, Sri Lanka was classified by another very big imperialist financial funding agency, the World Bank, as an upper middle income country, an MIC. So in 2019, the World Bank, classified Sri Lanka as a upper middle income country, making Sri Lanka ineligible for concessionary development loans, and therefore forcing Sri Lanka to borrow from private capital markets at very high interest rates. Now, add to this, kind of, domination and arm twisting, add to this, the country has borne several years of, misgovernance of the Rajpaksha. So certain things just, combine and make the situation extremely difficult and a burden for the ordinary people. So misgovernance on one hand, and then these kind of diktats and arm twisting by big financial international, bodies, and you have a recipe for a disaster. Now, the Sri Lankan president who fled the country, the former Sri Lankan president, Gotabaya Rajpaksha, who interestingly spent a significant part of his life working in America, entered into the post of president, entered into the office of the presidency in 2019, and he immediately imposed a series of neoliberal economic policies. So this is just part and parcel of a larger package of misgovernance by, Rajpakshas, and before Rajpakshas also other governments, which included basically, these neoliberal economic policies introduced in an intensive form in 2019, were, measures like cutting taxes on corporations. Now, these, neoliberal policies, of course, brought down government revenue even before the pandemic of COVID-19 set in and had its shock effects. Of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic's repercussions, this already, troubling situation, was such that with the already existing neoliberal policies in place, the impact and the shock of the pandemic was even greater. The country was even least prepared for, what was to unfold from then on, from 2020 onwards. Of course, there are, several important, interventions which have traced a longer history of, neoliberal policies by the various Sri Lankan governments, and various developments over a period of time that involve bodies like the IMF, the World Bank in Sri Lanka. A lot of interesting studies and works on the region of South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and how Sri Lanka has been at a crossroads of a lot of arm twisting. So of course, I'm just drawing some of the important points from there, and it's a longer history from which I'm just giving some semblance, some key highlights. For example, one important moment in Sri Lanka's financial problems is, of course, the period immediately after the 2008 global financial crisis. Now, what actually happened is that after 2008, low interest rates were introduced by advanced countries, advanced lending countries, so as to make credit cheaply available to many of these what were called frontier economies, distant economies in places like South Asia. So Sri Lanka became a hub for a lot of such cheap credit to be channelized. And the Sri Lankan government, from this period, was known to have, so successive governments post 2008 were known to have relied on what are known as international sovereign bonds to finance a lot of the government spending. And particularly, therefore, we have these interesting, figures and data, in the public domain. So between 2012 and 2020, the debt to the gross domestic product, ratio in Sri Lanka actually doubled to about 80%, with a very large share of this debt going towards bonds. Now, the payment, due to these debts, the payments that the government would need to make whenever these bonds went cashed, kept rising in relation to what the Sri Lankan economy could earn from, for example, exports or from the money sent back home by Sri Lankans working abroad. So the disruptions caused, of course, subsequently in 2020 by the pandemic, and then later the war in Ukraine, have been such that they have made matters worse by causing another dimension to intensify, which is Sri Lanka's export earnings to fall very sharply, and simultaneously a second dimension that has immediately played itself out in the last few months is the increasing price of essential imports, including food and fuel, particularly due to the war in Ukraine. Now, foreign exchange reserves, therefore, of Sri Lanka have plummeted, they've fallen. But interestingly, while this was happening, the foreign exchange reserves of Sri Lanka were falling, the Sri Lankan government, continued to pay interest. Even, interest, it was continuing to pay, for the bonds that were being encashed, even when it could not import essential fuel for its people, for its citizens. Now, these are things that we need to understand, by connecting certain dots. So first things first, let's try to see how the larger global capital, these larger international financial agencies and interests, how are they, of course, contributing to the situation? I already indicated through the World Bank's categorization of Sri Lanka in 2019, as an upper middle income, country, and therefore making it harder for Sri Lanka to avail of certain loans at concessionary rates. Add to this the fact that, the past period of incredibly low interest rates being offered by advanced economies, has literally meant that more funds, are invested in these so-called, distant frontier markets, like, these economies in South Asia, such as Sri Lanka, etc. So the richer world, on low interest rates is, channelizing money, investing in these so-called frontier markets. But of course, this foreign capital, it flees, it runs away as soon as, there is any signs of problem, right? So capital flees from these low and middle income countries, such as, Sri Lanka, at the first sign of any kind of, problem. And this, of course, means that given this tendency, these low and middle income countries, there is a lot of pressure on their, on their governments not to increase fiscal spending, precisely because there's this constant fear that there will be a flight of capital, flight of investors. And therefore, we see, particularly during, the period of the COVID pandemic, these economies of low and middle income countries have, literally, not been able to come out of, the shock that the pandemic brought to various economies in any meaningful way. So the recovery post the pandemic has therefore been muted, has been very less, more so as export and tourism revenues, for example, of Sri Lanka, have fallen sharply. And, imperialist lenders like the International Monetary Fund keep on rigidly insisting on repayment. And of course, not just repayment, but also, these imperialist lenders like the IMF, they when they take repayment, they also take it through a system of surcharges. So the initial, money given to you at a low interest rate, well, that's just the basic. Then you add the surcharges, the additional costs, and it comes to a whopping amount that needs to be repaid. And of course, this brings us to the question that why was Sri Lanka continuously paying right up till April 2022 is a fundamental question. Despite the fact that things were so bad, the country's government continued to pay. So we need to understand this. Why did this happen, and what exactly is it about this? I would call it the debt scam, because it's really manufactured. It's really a staged crisis. So let me say that the threat is not just from the Western forces. So this is a very crucial observation that many of us wanted to share. That the threat is not just from the IMF. It's not just from American capitalists, and certain companies. But of course, we need to see that how Sri Lanka is entering into a trap at this moment. It is a trap which is created both by local financial capital and global financial capital. So let me just, to explain this further, let me take you to 2015. 2015, when the central bank's bond scam surfaced. Now, in this scam, the central bank, and I'm sharing what is many of us see as a low and very conservative estimate. It must have been much more than that. But, this official so-called estimate exposed to the scam was that, Sri Lanka lost more than 11 million US dollars. And that has, more importantly, opened the way, to what is known as vulture funds. So let me, bring the discussion to the vulture funds. Now, these are funds, vulture funds arise when, the government, to finance its budget, issues sovereign bonds and, international financial companies. And these financial companies include shell companies, companies that are just on paper, of both outsiders, so global capitalists, but also rich Sri Lankan capitalists. So, international financial companies of both outsiders and insiders and certain banks, buy the sovereign bonds during, especially during a crisis. The sovereign bonds are very quickly bought up at, importantly note, discounted prices. Sometimes, the discounts go as much as 90%. So 90% of a discounted price, a private financial company is purchasing a country's sovereign bonds. Now, of course, this is happening because, these financial players, both local and global capital, they have, a certain backing by the political establishment. So this means that the local government, is very much imbricated in this theft. And of course, international rating agencies as well, are backing this process and facilitating it. Now, when encashed, these bonds, when encashed, these companies, are paid the full price. That means the real price of the sovereign bond is paid back to them, and not the price which was the discounted price at which they bought the bond. Now, we also see that, the government pays these companies exorbitant interests, which therefore makes, the repayment so onerous and literally impossible to pay after a certain point of time. Now, it leads to the pressure to sell, of course, very quickly. It translates precisely into this. The government, therefore, enters into a situation where it is having to sell strategic assets, public sector undertakings, prime land, etc., to these companies, so that the country is therefore forced to sell strategic assets, which includes land at low prices, public sector infrastructure, etc. So the purpose is actually not debt repayment. So this entire transactions that unfold through the sale of these sovereign bonds and their repayment is, it's actually not even a debt repayment, but actually the putting into place very firmly of a debt trap. So the whole agenda is not to facilitate repayment. The entire agenda is to create a debt trap. Now, already international agencies have made a list of strategic assets of Sri Lanka, which includes strategic, pieces of land. It includes airports, harbors or ports, telecom frequencies, transport facilities, etc. So earlier also, just some time back, we saw, just to give you an example, the sale of the Yugadhanani power plant, which was sold to an American company, New Fortress. So we're just going to see this entire process of, what is known as asset stripping intensify in the coming days. So strategic, facilities and assets of the country are going to be sold at what we often say in Hindi, kodiyon ke daam, at such ridiculously low prices. Now, the international agencies, that I have indicated earlier, like these rating and valuation, agencies, and these legal consultancy companies, we really need to understand how they are implicated in all these transactions and the staged debt crisis. Now, these, rating and valuation companies, these legal consultancy companies, they play a very, very murky role in undervaluing the price of these strategic assets of a country, and later, after buying of these assets by some of the financiers in the global market, these financiers end up selling those assets to other companies at high price. So you buy cheap, and then you sell those strategic assets at very high prices to another buyer, another company. And of course, here, as I mentioned earlier, the shell companies become, a very worrying phenomenon, because many a times the financiers, are basically, working through these shell companies. They're purchasing, assets at very low prices, and then they are selling it to actual companies at much higher prices. Now, clearly, a country like Sri Lanka, loses a lot in this regard. So the global trap of these financial companies, these legal consultancy companies, is a phenomena. It's a formidable phenomena that is shaping what's going to happen in Sri Lanka in the coming days. So the debt trap is very, very closely linked, and I just repeat this, to the asset stripping of the country. Now, we, of course, are predominantly hearing a lot about the International Monetary Fund in this process of, austerity measures, the asset stripping of the country. But let me again re-emphasize something I've said earlier. The IMF is a body, it's an international funding agency, which is working closely. Of course, it's working closely with companies which are, these foreign companies, especially American companies like BlackRock and other companies, PIMCO, etc. But there are, insiders as well, players within Sri Lanka who are very much part of this asset stripping, are very much part of keeping this debt trap intact. So I would say that it almost seems at one level, while it seems there is an outside conspiracy, but there is actually, if you look very closely, a close link between the global financiers, the global imperialist forces, and the local dominant class and the political establishment in Sri Lanka. So increasingly, capital is creating a worldwide network of tax havens. Now, it is a kind of, international financial arrangement wherein money is routed through these so-called tax havens. Not so-called, they are actually tax havens, to these tax havens, so as to hide this money from the regulations of, the laws of sovereign governments. Connected with this, let's see how Sri Lanka's distress debt is actually owned by insiders who route a lot of their money through tax havens. So it's not just, as I say, global players, global finances, but a lot of this distress debt that is burdening Sri Lanka is actually owed to insiders. And here, of course, I'm referring to the likes of people like the Rajpaksas, the Vikramasinghes, etc. What am I referring to when I say, the insiders like Rajpaksa, the Rajpaksha family, Vikramasinghe? Well, I'm here referring to the Pandora Papers leak, for example. This expose revealed the names of people like Nirupama Rajapaksa, who is Mahinda Rajapaksa's niece, that means a former prime minister, and her husband, Nirupama Rajapaksa's husband, Nadesan, Mr. Nadesan, was also implicated. His name also came up in this, Pandora Papers leak. The expose showed how, these people, these two people have purchased sovereign bonds at discounted prices through various offshore accounts. So really, I mean, given that you have, very concretely speaking, insiders who are contributing to this debt trap, to this distressed debt of Sri Lanka, it's interesting to read this kind of, information that we have, along with, how the global financiers are, reading the situation and reacting. So I like to draw attention to a report that came in the Financial Times.
Comrade Maya, sorry for apologies for disturbing. Shall we go for the question and answers in 5 minutes?
Okay, so I would need maybe 5 minutes to conclude this point about the IMF.
Sure, yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So the Financial Times of 8th February 2022 quoted an investment banker, Richard House, who's the head of the emerging market debt at Alliance Global Investors, who said, and I quote him, the Sri Lankan government, is demonstrating an amazing willingness to pay. But why they would want to, I am flabbergasted. They are bankrupt, pretty much, quote close. So really, many of the insider vulture fund owners, are going to be earning, and they have been earning 25 to 45% profits on the actual cost of bonds, whereas many times the bonds are then, go on to be sold at depressed prices. So we do need to recognize that we have an enemy very much within Sri Lanka in terms of, our local capitalists. I would, like to also highlight that we have enough information now in the public arena, about the kind of dominant, role that Sri Lankans, as of 2020, played in the Dubai real estate market. The Dubai real estate market saw almost 590 prime properties in Dubai, valued at 205 million American dollars, being owned by roughly 400 Sri Lankans. So, as I keep saying, there is, both global and local capital, interests, which are informing the situation today. I would like to, highlight here that in the so-called negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, a big part of the negotiations is debt restructuring, which is basically prioritizing several of the sovereign bond owners' claims. So a large part of the money that's going to be procured from the IMF will not be used, as I said in the beginning of my lecture, will not be used to buy essential commodities that Sri Lankans need from the international market, but it will be used to pay the financiers. So moreover, when clauses of many of the financial contracts, stipulate that, interest-free periods should be used or should be brought in during periods of crisis, and Sri Lanka is going through a crisis. Why is it that the Sri Lankan government has not been using those clauses? And literally, why is it till April it was paying, making these repayments? And I think we can answer those two uncomfortable questions by precisely highlighting this fact that because there are so many insiders who are benefiting from the debt trap, and they're going to benefit from the debt restructuring, which is why we are seeing this situation, and which is why we've seen Wickremesinghe being brought into the helm of affairs as president. I would just, like to emphasize here and move towards the conclusion. So what are the pro-people economic measures that are the need of the hour, that the Janata Raglia needs to deliberate on and mobilize on? Now, contrary to the path dictated by global and local capital, which is a path to Sri Lanka's ruination and the devastation of a people, is the alternative route, which represents what many of us are, are arguing, the unfolding of the workers and peasants' struggles against capital. So it is important to understand the structural location of the laboring masses and anchoring, that reality within the movement today. The structural location of the laboring masses is such that their objective interests is in complete contradiction with the other route or the other path sought by the rich for Sri Lanka's so-called recovery. And some are saying this, that, let the Raglia, let the people struggle be neutral, and let it not be divided along the lines of left and right. But I say, can we afford to do this? At this juncture, can we afford to do this? And especially when we know from where the Raglia started. It started from the most vulnerable sections of Sri Lankan society, organizing themselves against the neoliberal policies of Rajapaksa. So, having said this, I would say that the second path, or the second way forward, the alternative that that is before us at this crossroad, we need to understand that Sri Lanka's economies has an imminent internal capacity to mobilize its existing internal resources to manage this crisis, to tide over it. So why aren't these being mobilized? It's a choice that Sri Lankan people have to make. They either choose to be dictated by the IMF path, the path sought after by local and global capitalists, or they go with, of course, the alternative path, The alternative path being something that I have shared earlier, but I just quickly highlight them. The alternative measures at this juncture mean addressing the fuel crisis, wherein the vehicles of the wealthy, the rich, these petrol guzzling vehicles should be forbidden from the road, and only public transport and the vehicles used by the middle class and laboring masses should be allowed. Payment for electricity that is demanded should be much higher from higher income families, from higher income households. This would enable us to provide electricity to lower income households at a low cost. The inputs used by the small peasantry should be subsidized so that the country's food production is stabilized. This should be done to ensure that in the intermediate period, the country does not have to import staple consumption items in large amounts. The stolen wealth, which is actually being created by the laboring masses of Sri Lanka, but accumulated by the wealthy, needs to be reappropriated and channelized to the social sector. We know Sri Lanka has vast plantations and tea companies, wherein a large section of the laboring people work. These, along with large industrial enterprises, should be nationalized, and the vast wealth and profits of these enterprises should be used to purchase essential commodities. I would say for Marxists, one important reality for all of us is that we always are driven by this fundamental question: what labor gives to the economy and how much does it get back? Our politics is anchored on that. So what is going to be the subsequent condition of Sri Lanka's laboring masses? If we go via the IMF and local capitals, path or solution, so-called solution, we're going to see basically Sri Lankan labor situation becoming such that more labor, longer work hours are going to be extracted from Sri Lankan workers in comparison to labor in other parts of the world. We're going to see more indebted peasantry. So this is the kind of, dismal future that lies ahead. Having said that, I would just end with saying that we need to see Araglia in continuity with and culmination of waves of movements. That is the peasant movement of last year, the teachers movement, the general strikes by workers, etc. In that vein, we need to rebuild the movement on the basis of the class power, the objective interests of the laboring masses. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you so much, Comrade Maya. I really appreciate the information and the kind of the politics that you shared with us. Very informative and thought-provoking. So now we are opening up the session for the questions and answers. And if you have any questions, comments, please raise your hands and you can direct them to Dr. Maya, or you can actually put them in the chat so I can read out. So you can ask questions in both Sinhala and English. I'll try to translate if someone is asking questions in Sinhala. So the floor is for the audience.
Halper?
Yes, Professor Nalini, can go ahead.
Can I just, yeah.
Sure, please.
Thank you, Maya, for such a detailed and an insightful presentation. Can you hear me, Maya? I am Nalini Henayak.
I can hear you, comrade.
Yeah, it's a simple question that comes to my mind from the last comment that you made, that there is a need for remobilizing, having class as the basis of this Aragalaya. I just want your opinion on this, just to ask, does that imply that the Janata Aragalaya, whatever the way in which it has unfolded so far, actually has not been articulated in terms of that, or there are other kinds of agendas in it? Just your thoughts on that.
Comrade Maya, I think you are muted. No, it's still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Nalini, thank you for that question. The Janata Araglia has been, especially what we've seen in the months of May, June, July, has been a multi-class movement. What we are observing, what we are suggesting at this conjuncture, is that we need to go beyond that. How else will we mobilize the larger numbers, unless we bring out that class differential aspect, unless we bring out how the country's laboring poor are going to be impacted by the coming policies. So that is what we mean to say that, we need to anchor now the objective interests of the laboring masses at this juncture within the movement. That's going to be a turning point that's going to get us out of this deadlock. Comrade, what I mean, Nalini, what I mean to say is we need to make labor a pole of attraction, and we need to expand the hegemony over the other classes, that have extended support to this movement.
Professor Nalini, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I would let others come in, and then I will think about it more and then come back if there's any.
Sure. Comrade Maurizio, you have a question.
Yes, hello to everyone. Thank you very much for having me also here. It's very, very powerful really to follow also from Italy what is going on. Just having two words to say why I'm connected to this morning on Zoom. In Italy, we have a big Sri Lankan community living in here since years. It's not a new phenomenon. It's something that it's existing since the 80s. And we are working, I'm living in Naples, we are working very closely together with the Sri Lankan community and the Sri Lankan left in exile, building up moments of protests, of sensibilization, of bringing like the message of the people's movement from Sri Lanka also into Italy to explain what is going on and to support the people's struggle. So this is something very fundamental for us, as internationalism was always like one of the main points of our political activity. I have one question. Maybe it's a question that it's typical when it's coming from outside and not from like the continent and the country itself. But what is happening in the last days remembers me a lot to the 2019 movement in Algeria. In Algeria, there was in 2019 a mass movement taking to the streets, asking for a radical political change, a radical economic change also in the direction of social justice and building a future for the new generations, for a very young society in Algeria. And they tried to smash this mass movement in Algeria also, like with first of all early elections, like putting just changing the face of the presidency and saying that it is something new, but of course everything went on as before. And then with a huge intervention of the military, of the repression, like arresting journalists, young activists, and so on. And my question is like, what is the role of the military in Sri Lanka? Is the role of the military so like linked, like in other countries we have, for example, in the Middle East, or is the nature of the military different? Can we compare the role of the military in Sri Lanka with the role of the military in Egypt, in Algeria, as I said, or in other countries? Or do we have to consider it differently? And so like the impact of the military that the military can have in the near future on the mass movement is different. I don't know if it is clear what I mean, but it's just like the role of the military also in the class composition. I think, yeah, I think it's understandable. Thank you.
Thanks, comrade.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Let me take the last observation first about the military. Thank you for your comments. You see, the thing is that in the case of Sri Lanka, this is a civil war hardened, military. The country has seen decades of, this opportunistic politics. Sinhalese versus Tamil. And, it's therefore a force to contend with, and which is why, successive regimes, including this one that has come into power, is pumping in a lot of money into the military. So it's definitely, going to be a challenge. It has been a challenge for, the democratic progressive voices in Sri Lanka that have even spoken out earlier against civil war. What I'm saying is that, of course, these agencies of the state are going to be mobilized against, activists, against protesters, pushing them into the defensive. But that's what I started off by saying, that we lost a crucial momentum earlier in July, because when the large numbers were there, when people were on the street, when the movement was there, and it was rising, it was not ebbing, it was rising. At that point of time, for the military to hit and to be used that easily was very difficult. And that was a crucial juncture at which we could have clinched the alternative that people actually wanted. Now, you referred to Maurizio, other instances in the recent past where we've seen these kind of huge upsurges, and that's precisely where I'm coming from. It's precisely my angst as a communist is that the left has lost opportunity, has lost strategic advantage positions in the past also, and even in Sri Lanka today. People are actually they've been mobilized, and they're on this verge when they want massive political change. But we, the left, are still so constrained by the politics of representation, the mainstream politics of representation. So we're not able to put in place, a structure, possible workable, institutions which can, bring people back into, the decision making, which can empower people, and which is what people on the street, when they're agitating and fighting in large numbers, actually want. So we're not able to translate the discontent, which is actually very anti-systemic, into actual political change that is demanded, that is somewhere aspired for, that is wanted. So let me just, highlight what we lost out in terms of a strategic advantage when the movement was on a high point, around 14 July, when the presidential elections to the parliament were announced. It was a crucial moment where, we could have rallied the people into demanding, that, this is not something that they will stand with. They are not going to wait around for, a few parliamentarians to decide the next president. And, it's ironic that, one of the key left parties in the parliament themselves made floated a candidate, for the election. So we really lost that very crucial chance where we could have actually, exposed in a formidable way the parliament, the presidency system, and we could have started constituting people's assemblies at the strong points of Araglia. Wherever Araglia was the strongest, of course, overnight on the 14th or 15th of July, it's not like the whole of Sri Lanka would have established people's assemblies. But in the hotbeds of Araglia, we could have formed those bodies. We could have formed those bodies which, from which then the people's councils could have been, further crystallized as more permanent structures. So I'm saying that, it is unfortunate, it's been happening again and again. It's because our coordinates, our ideological envisioning and coordinates of what is the possible alternative is still very constrained to the politics of, representation, the way we see it in parliamentary systems, etc. We need to break that coordinate, and we need to really, catch on to the very concrete disinterest with the political system itself that people have. They really want change. They don't want another snap election. So we need to therefore rebuild, the future phase of Araglia in this way. And Sri Lanka has really shown us the way. This is why so many of us have been watching this moment closely. They have shown through the people's mobilization in Araglia how much people can actually take on state power, and how much they actually want a completely different form of state, where people are part of the process, not a few self-seeking politicians.
Thank you, comrade, and thank you, Mauricio, for the question. And I want to take this opportunity to express something, to share something with you. And the state repression right now in Sri Lanka is so high, and I think building up a sort of regional and international solidarity with the strugglers, with the people who are actually involved in the struggle is really important. So I want all the comrades who are participating here to share the message that the state repression is so real right now, and they're using it as a mechanism to stop the movement. So share the message and build up the solidarity. And I think it's a great responsibility for all of us to protect this movement from the state suppression. Any other questions? We can go for a couple of other questions and comments if you have.
Kalpa,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add on here to what you shared, this very important concern. So we are coordinating with other international fronts to launch a day of international level protests in solidarity with Araglia, and of course exposing this kind of day-to-day growing repression by Vikramasinghe. So we'll be in touch for that in international level campaign.
Great. Any other questions, comments? There are two questions on the chat, I think.
I'll just read them.
Yeah, sure. Maya, maybe you should try to answer the second question first.
Sorry, again, I was muted. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So this is the question I can see at my level about what should leftists based outside Sri Lanka. Is that the one?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So see, it's just it's an appeal actually that I'm making. Of course, we need to do much more than just providing or mobilizing financial support or legal assistance for those who are currently being intimidated by the regime. I think a very fundamental thing that all of us need to do wherever we are situated, whether in Sri Lanka or outside, is that we really, change, and I keep saying this, change the coordinates of how we're thinking, and we really need to, drive home this point in our own circles, in our own, spaces, that, we need to do much more. We need to take on head on, this politics of representation, because there's a whole new world possible beyond this, whole politics of elections and parliaments, the way they have existed and currently exist. So I think, driving home the point in our discussions, in our debates, in our meetings, in our literature about the problems with, the generalized, system of representation that exists worldwide is what we need to, bring to the forefront, because that's precisely what we even saw the Sri Lankan people's movement at crucial junctures doing. It was actually delegitimizing in a significant way all those institutions. I would say, and I've read this, I have, written this in a piece I'd shared earlier, a few days back, we need to decolonize democracy. The politics of representation, the way we see democracy function through certain political institutions today is really a colonial construct. The colonial elite, in their process of negotiation with native elites in different parts of the world, evolve these systems of elections and representation. Are we just going to go on with those traditions, or are we going to think of other structures where there is accountability at each level and people are part of each level of the government and decision-making? So really, that's what I mean to say. We need to decolonize, democracy, think of a new revolutionary form of democracy, which many a times people's movement, like in Sri Lanka, has been, indicating that this is actually what people want. The left needs to deliver on that. It needs to pick up on that discontent and give it shape, not through fitting into the system of elections and institutions that are there, but by building new ones, by building new kinds of, institutions in which people, have a say.
Thank you, Maya. And any other questions, comments?
Kalpa, I'm Dinukar.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maya, what I want to, one question. What I want to know is about this People's Council experience. Do we have any experience in India about this kind of exposure about the People's Council or different kind of movements other than to the Parliament? Are there any experience from your country?
Maya, you are muted actually. Maya?
Sorry, I always do this. I'm not very used to the Zoom platform. You can hear me?
Yes, okay.
So in India, a very, very crucial moment is around the time of, from roughly, 1947 into 1950. So what we call, the formative years when, the Indian Constitution was being deliberated by Constituent Assembly. A Constituent Assembly, please remember, which was based on a property franchise, an election based on the property franchise of 1946. So the Constituent Assembly was obviously, representing only certain interests, property interests in India, and formulating a constitution which gelled with those kind of interests and ideals of India. So while, you have, the politics of the Constituent Assembly unfolding, the early Indian government formulating certain kinds of laws and policy, in India's villages, in various corners of India, there were these huge peasant movements, huge workers' movements, which were functioning through their own councils and actually posing a challenge to the mainstream bourgeois system of representative politics and constitution framing. So we actually have a very interesting legacy in both rural India and parts of urban India in this period around the 50s, where you have peasant leagues and workers leagues, which are very active and reaching decisions and building opinions and critiques to which the Indian state is often responding through force, through repression. I can just give an example. The Telangana movement, for example, is a formidable movement on the question of land reform and many other, struggle against caste bias, etc. But brutally suppressed. And that was because those kind of initiatives were not generalized, across the country. Again, we lost crucial momentum. So we hope these are not repeated again. And there is adequate regrouping and re-strategizing where potential is emerging today.
Thank you, Maya. There are two questions on the chat, but let me read the first one by Judith Dimel. Sri Lankan leftist politics has a haunting past, one that is not too long ago, just one generation ago. This always pops up every time leftist ideologies are brought up. How can our leftist parties and centrists come together and build trust again? Maybe you can try to answer that.
I'm just also seeing the other questions. I thought I'll answer together. Can I just read the questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me just respond to both these questions together. I think, of course, the left movement in Sri Lanka, it needs to, go to the people, regroup. Okay, this is not a time for just the same format of campaigning that we used earlier. We need to as I said, anchor the struggle very differently at this juncture. So this means going to the people, explaining, as I said earlier, the differential impact of what is happening in Sri Lanka. And we need to remember that the biggest loss that has been faced and will be faced more intensely is that of the majority, which is the country's laboring poor. So we really need to bring them and their issues into the forefront at this juncture, because there is where our strength lies. The laboring poor are the majority, they are the large number, and we need their numbers in this movement. I would say that, we therefore need to prioritize that kind of format now at this juncture. Secondly, in terms of the second question, that of course, as I've said this, that we failed to give an ultimatum to the parliament at a very crucial point in July, just before the election of Wickremesinghe as president. I think what I need to say is that on 14th July, when the presidential elections were announced, we should have made 19th July as a day of march to parliament, a day that we give an ultimatum to that parliament, that they will not enforce executive presidency on the people, that they are going to negotiate with soon to be formed people's assemblies and councils. That should have been what our strategy on the 19th of July was. Now that of course has passed, that moment has passed. So if we build anew with a strengthened mobilization of the majority, the laboring masses in Sri Lanka, then this brings us to the question of how is it exactly, many people seem to be asking this, it's also hinted in this other question in the chat box, how are these people's assemblies and councils going to be formed? Let's be very clear. People in movement, people in agitation, right? People in the process of mobilization, they come together. That process of coming together, gathering together, assembling, right? Which is why precisely they want to implement those emergency measures against your freedom of assembly, because that moment, that process of assembling is actually very, very crucial. It harbors the potential that coming together, that mobilization harbors the potential for people then to form these kind of platforms where they are deliberating, where they are discussing. And it is then, through that those kind of assemblies which are formed in the process of people getting mobilized and grouping, right, for a major action program, that we then see this format of assembling and decision making through platforms made by people get generalized, and hence not just restricted to Colombo, okay, but getting generalized, and it becomes like the norm. People, it's like people get habituated to it. Then it's like, why didn't you ask us? It becomes that kind of, format then. And from there, therefore, from this kind of momentum that is gained, that we will be able to then, from these assemblies, create more permanent bodies. That's the People's Council. So every People's Assembly would have a more permanent deliberative body, the People's Council. But first, we need to be able to come back to that moment of mobilization of the majority who are facing the biggest hit right now. So the next stage is really, we should plan for a march to Parliament, because that's going to be one major action program around which we can go to the people, mobilize again, regroup, and give an ultimatum on a certain day, that this is the day of the march to the Parliament, and we are giving this ultimatum to the Parliament that they will pass a resolution. I mean, one suggestion we're giving is the resolution should be that they will not use the police and military against civilian protesters, campaigners of the Janata Raghu. And obviously, we know they will not deliver on that. And we can take it from there.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much. Any other questions? We can wrap up the session in maybe 10 minutes. Any other questions, comments?
If I can.
Yes.
It's Kumar here. Yes, just on the question of Parliament and the tactics towards it. I mean, firstly, it's not the case that the movement or sections of the movement did not target Parliament. In fact, there were a couple of mobilizations, particularly of the Inter-University Students' Federation, which did blockade the access road to Parliament, and which also came under immediate repression, forcing them to leave that area. And more recently, when around the time of the vote, when there was also discussion around a march on Parliament, it did transpire that orders were given to use live fire to prevent protesters from physically occupying the Parliament premises. So it's not that it was not in the sights of the protesters, but I think one had to take a very sober call on what the costs of that particular strategy were going to be, particularly when the consciousness of the movement is not a consciousness that could yet transcend seeing some reformed Parliament as being the place in which people's issues and grievances would be resolved. So certainly a delegitimization of parliamentarians and the party political system, but not yet a delegitimization of the idea of a parliament which is selected or elected in the way in which it is under liberal democracy. So, and there were views within those supportive of the Aragalaya that there should not be, certainly there was an overestimation that somehow the weight of the people's mood outside of Parliament would influence the parliamentarians within it, and that they would accept the demand for all-party government, for a neutral president and prime minister from outside of the existing makeup of Parliament and so on. I wanted to just place some of these things on the record in terms of how we understand that and in terms of how we go forward. Of course, I defend the right of people anywhere to picket outside the Parliament. That is a democratic right. It is Parliament is not some sacrosanct place. It is equally our right to make our demands and for people inside those buildings to feel and know that we are outside of it. That's one. I want to come back also on the question of the left. And I hope not in a defensive way, but trying also to understand why it is that we have not been able to see some radicalization of the demands and some, you could say, proletarianization of the movement, which would then be also reflected in the demands. Firstly, let's not forget that there is a so-called left within within the state, which is in this parliament too. And that is a left that, although initially a little silent, is now using the term color revolution to describe the Aragalaya, that is now talking about foreign funding from imperialism, talking about Tamil diaspora funding to achieve its ends through this people's movement. So that is also the left, even if we don't identify with it ourselves. Secondly, as was mentioned, the JVP in terms of the mainstream anti-governmental left has for a long time now framed itself as a parliamentary party and within a parliamentary framework, and its demand for general elections or immediate elections right from the beginning of this struggle, which is now also revived now, of course, once again reinforces the idea that somehow this institution and the system by which its representatives are elected, can be rehabilitated. Somehow going to the electorate now means that you would get a more representative parliament. Well, in fact, you would get a parliament which is very similar to in makeup to the one we have now. There is no shortcut. Early general elections will not somehow lead to some progressive alternative. At best, we might be able to see, as perhaps the JVP envisions, some increase in its own representation. Then if we look at the second current within the protest movement from the left, the FSP, this was the current which from the beginning kept trying to push the movement to see the answer to its problems as not being within parliament, and that's why it tried to popularize this slogan around power beyond parliament, people's power. In other words, that this power resides within the people and not and should not be seen in these 225 members. And also, of course, then pushing for people's councils as or people's council, what ought to be people's councils in the plural, as as a counterforce, not somehow seeing it as a situation in which it replaces yet parliament, but somehow again a permanent mobilization of people's representatives, which can somehow place pressure on parliament. I mean, we have none of these are things that we have had before or tried before here. So it's not that we have some blueprint. And anyway, we this battle is not a battle that we can go back in history and find some easy ways of understanding why it worked and why the past didn't work. My last point, Dr. Maya John, is that I feel that there is an overestimation of the left in your analysis. And again, I do not wish this to be seen as something coming from a position of being defensive in terms of justifying them. By no means. I'm simply trying to be sober as to the limits of what this left is or can do, coming out of many decades of defeats, demobilization, retreat of the intellectuals, and lack of organizing capacity within class-based movements. It's not that we have some vibrant, massive, growing trade union movement. We don't. If you look at the number of strikes and class militancy, it's very low. It's not that we have some great, mobilized force in the rural areas. The farmers' protests of last year were very important, but those protests did not then survive into this year and did not join with this Aragalaya in the same way. So we are in a situation where it's not the case that we somehow simply have these existing social forces which are being held back by the left's parliamentarist framework. There are certain sections of the left certainly parliamentarists, and larger sections of those who identify with the left but who are not organized in it. Agreed. But I'm also trying to say that, you know, the fact that the trade union leaders who come from the left were unable to keep their to mobilize beyond those two very important actions of April 28th and May 6th is also a reflection that they don't also believe that they can keep their members, bring their members out and keep them on the streets indefinitely. Certainly not who are those in the private sector. Those in the public sector, yes, but not those who are in the private sector. So I wish to play some of this before you because I think otherwise we also risk both sort of romanticizing certain aspects of what we have experienced, which has been an incredible experience for those of us who have participated in it, but also of overestimating the forces of resistance, specifically of the left. Sorry for the length. Thank you all.
Thank you, comrade. Maya, do you want to respond to that, or do you have any comments to share?
Several. Let me see if I can do justice to the observations. See, first of all, I would like to clarify that I am not overestimating, what is the potential of the Araglo. I am well aware of the problems, the limitations on the ground, the challenges that the left there, has been facing for some time. But that's what I'm saying. The aspiration does not need to be small. The aspiration and the planning, has to be as per, the pulse, the general pulse that we have seen in this movement. So let me give you like just an example through what the Russian Empire in 1917, for example, saw. So of course, in February 1917, the Bolshevik Party was a minority, and Lenin returns, in April to Russia, and there is re-strategizing, regrouping that happens, and it's a critique, a very formidable critique, emerges despite the fact that there are problems on the ground, despite the fact that the Bolsheviks are in small in number, that we cannot afford the moment to be captured by by those who are trying to put into place some kind of model of continuity, the Kerensky. Basically, we can't be swayed by the Kerensky kind of moment of provisional government, which will grant some concessions on one hand, but more or less play the larger game and keep Russia in war. So I'm just by drawing that example, I'm saying, of course, our numbers may be our numbers may not be the numbers that we want in the left, but we know that we are the force, we are the political force that can give final shape to the people's aspirations. So why do we want to give up that ground? People assembled in large numbers, they can again be reassembled in large numbers on their objective concrete interests, and we can build anew. Why do we want to let go of the momentum? I mean, why do we want to not see that we're losing momentum? Why don't we try to rebuild the momentum? Is what I'm saying, and that aspiration is very, very crucial, because it's only on the basis of that people can be again assembled in large numbers, and from those assemblies then we can create the necessary political future, as I said, the people's councils, which are more permanent bodies for deliberation. Of course, I'm saying that doesn't mean that the immediate institutions like the parliament would necessarily just be waiting and watching for us to do this. It's a test of nerves. They have from 9th of July and subsequent to Rajapaksa fleeing the country, the ruling elites, the economically dominant classes have been regrouping. They have been preparing precisely for this. Our appeal is, that we also, knowing that things at a crossroad, we're losing momentum as we speak, we re-strategize, and we also prepare. We prepare for the offensive. And let me just say that it's not just a matter of 14 July and the announcement of the elections. 9th July itself was a crucial turning point. From 9th July to 14th July, what was going to be our concrete strategy in terms of constructing that alternative stemming from the discontent, the critique. I know you're saying there are many quarters and voices in the movement. I agree, it was a multi-class movement, but wasn't one very concrete aspiration precisely this? It may have been diffused, but wasn't it there that all 225 parliamentarians are problematic? They all should resign. It was never just about Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So I'm saying that basis was there. We failed to build on it from 9th July, and it became even more evident on 14th July. When Wickremesinghe's bid for elections became a more or less foregone conclusion. So I'm just saying that in that vein, I would say that whatever reflections we have of this of this movement, I think that we need to also factor in this need for self-criticism. That we did lose out a strategic advantage, offensive position that we had earlier in July. We also need to, when we're thinking about, and we're going through the process of self-criticism, why don't we realize that we precisely need to, also be critical of the fact that we've been very Colombo-centric. Of course, huge numbers gathered in Colombo, but perhaps in this, the new phase of the movement, definitely if it's going to be led by the left, it cannot be Colombo-centric. We need that mobilization. We need that powerful assembling of people to be generalized across Sri Lanka. It's easier to root us out if we are concentrated in one place. That strategy may have worked initially in the summer months. In our next phase, it's not going to necessarily work in our favor. I think, of course, it was an exciting moment. The large numbers collecting in Colombo. For some, it was a spectacle, and one can see that through various social media posts. But now, what is to be done? Now, can we just return to that format? Is really where I'm raising a question and concern. So what I'm saying is we need various assembling points, many assemblies of people, nodal points of mobilization of people throughout the country, from which then the march to Colombo, to the parliament, would make sense and would actually be feasible.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much. We can have just one last question, or comment maybe. Maya, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm a little bit curious that how do you interpret, or how do you actually map the impact of Sri Lankan people's struggle on Indian politics, especially on Indian establishment? You're muted, Maya. Maya?
Sorry, Kalpa. Well, Kalpa, the troubling thing here in India is that I don't see, the developments in Sri Lanka having, a major influence here on the fabric of, representative politics in India, because, India is huge. okay, geopolitically speaking, and it has a very, very entrenched system of, what I call as the colonial inherited representative system. And this is the irony of India, is that, even I'll just explain like this: we have elections all the time, different phases of elections all the time, the local councils, then it's, the state assemblies, and then it's the, the central legislature. So literally all political parties, including, the opposition parties, and this includes the parliamentary left in India, are literally busy preparing for elections all the year round. And so, being able to invest in, on the ground work with people and with segments of society which are actually the constituency of your politics it's getting minimal. So even in that ways, opposition parties are basically just locked into, the mathematics games of elections and electoral alliances. And this is so entrenched that, the interesting moments that we saw that question precisely this kind of structure of representative politics that emerged in Sri Lanka, it's not easily resonated here in India, given the, as I keep saying, the entrenched nature of this representative politics, party politics in India. So that would be my, but of course, for those who are, in the non-parliamentary, the revolutionary left, not the revisionist left, we do see the Janata Araglia as offering a very interesting way forward. And hence, we hope this dialogue continues. We hope there is more self-criticism, factoring in of, how things unfolded in July and how they could have been different. The need to go back to the people and create more centers of the struggle and not just Colombo. I think we need to do that, and we are trying. We are of course trying here our level best to pitch in whatever way we can, and we are taking inspiration from what's happened in Sri Lanka. It is of course a fresh breath of air for us. That another world is possible, and that minimal aspiration is very much there. So thank you. That ways, thank you to Sri Lanka and her people for at least offering us that. Sorry, my video was off all this time. I apologize.
Okay. It's okay, don't worry. Thank you so much, Maya. And maybe we can take one more question and wrap up the session. There was a question on the chat by Hasini. She's asking, we are experiencing the limits of representative democracy. What are the possibilities of direct democracy we can think of in our context? I think Maya also touched upon on the subject, on the question several times. Maya, do you want to say something? You are still muted.
Start assembling people, friends. Please start assembling people, and see how it goes from there. Many things fall into place as the campaign unfolds and people are being concretely mobilized on the ground. There, the potential emerges for evolving. What are the possible strategies on the ground, the platforms needed, etc. So first of all, we need to remember that we are at a stage where we are losing momentum, and so we need to build that again. And we need to, through a process of self-criticism, make sure that we're not repeating certain mistakes. And we need to spread Araglia's focal points to many more places.
Thank you, Maya. So I think with that note, we can wrap up the session. And I deeply thank Comrade Dr. Maya John for sharing her views and thoughts, and especially spending her valuable time with us. And this is not the last session. I mean, this is not the last webinar that we're expecting to do with her. And we're continuing to share our thoughts and solidarity among our comrades. And we expect her participation once again in another webinar, a possible webinar in the future. So I deeply appreciate your participation once again. And also I too see a lot of friend requests from India, especially from the student leaders and union members. And it's a great pleasure. And we are feeling that we are building up a kind of virtual movement, like virtual connection with people. It's a really pleasure. And I really appreciate your participation and raising questions, commenting. And for today, we are ending the session here. Thank you so much.
Kalpa, I'd just like to say one last thing. Of course, thank you and thank all the participants and all those who shared questions, concerns, and comments. Thank you. As I said, this is for larger deliberation. We will also be thinking about and trying to understand better what is unfolding with each day in Sri Lanka. I just like to say my final statement would be that generation after generation we aspire for revolution. We can't we really can't afford to lose the moment. We can't afford to lose the momentum. It's a process that we learn. I understand that we're learning in the process, and at least let's say that we keep pushing, we keep regrouping, we keep re-strategizing, because if we don't, it's a return of the status quo in a more entrenched form. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Kalpa, would it be possible to access the recording?
Yes, I'm going to share it with you, and we're going to upload it on our YouTube channel, Marx School Sri Lanka. So I can share the link with you as soon as possible.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please continue your good work. We really appreciate, and we share as much as possible. We are sharing your work and translating them into Sinhala, so it can reach the wider audience.
It's a big thanks for the translations. That's just wonderful that it happens regularly. So thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you. Take care.
Stay safe. Take care.